The baby's cries sliced through the desert air like glass. It was not loud. It was not strong. It was the kind of cry that made your heart stop because it sounded like it might be the last one. Thin, shaking, fading into the wind. Inside the luxury SUV, Daniel Hartley felt the world shift under his feet. Just minutes ago, he had been on a call worth millions. His voice steady, his tone confident. A man used to control. A man who owned buildings that touched the sky. A man who never lost. Now his phone lay forgotten on the leather seat beside him. He turned toward the back seat, and the sight stole the air from his lungs. His infant son's tiny face had gone pale. Not the soft pink of a sleeping child. Not the warm glow of health. Pale like paper. His small hands trembled weakly in the air. His chest rose in uneven jerks. Between each faint cry, there was silence. Too much silence. Why is he breathing like that? Daniel's voice cracked before he could stop it. The driver slammed the brakes so hard the SUV jolted forward in the sand. The engine had already been coughing for miles. Now it gave one last tired groan and died completely. Silence swallowed them. Outside, the desert stretched forever. Endless sand, endless heat, no buildings, no roads, no signal. Just wind dragging grains of dust across the metal body of a car worth more than most homes. Sir, the driver whispered, staring at the dashboard. The engine, it's gone. Daniel didn't care about the engine. He twisted around, reaching for his son. The baby's lips trembled. His breathing sounded tight, like something was stuck, like every breath was a fight. Call someone. Daniel barked. No signal, sir. Of course there wasn't. They were in the middle of nowhere. A shortcut, Daniel had insisted. Faster, more efficient. He hated wasting time. Now time was the only thing he didn't have. Another cry came from the baby. Weaker than before. It barely rose above the wind. Daniel felt something cold move through his chest. Fear. The kind he had not felt in years. Not in business. Not in courtrooms. Not in board meetings. This was different. This was his son. The sun burned overhead, pouring heat over the metal roof. Sweat gathered at Daniel's temple. But he felt cold. His expensive suit clung to his back as he leaned closer, panic tightening his throat. Do something, he shouted at the driver. The driver looked helpless. Sir, I'm not a doctor. The desert wind howled against the windows. And then Daniel felt it, a presence. He turned slowly toward the windshield. There, through the shimmer of heat rising from the sand, stood a small figure, a boy, no older than 10, barefoot. His clothes were loose and worn, faded by sun and sand. A thin scarf wrapped around his neck. His skin dusty from the road. He stood a few yards away from the SUV, still as stone, watching the car, watching the baby. Daniel's jaw tightened instantly. Of all moments, of all times. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. The boy took a cautious step closer, curiosity mixed with concern in his eyes. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't begging. He was simply looking. Daniel rolled the window down halfway and waved his hand sharply. Go away. The boy didn't move. I said go. Daniel snapped, his voice sharp with fear and frustration. We don't need help. The words came out harsher than he meant, but pride was a reflex for him. Control was a reflex. He did not accept help from strangers, especially not from a barefoot child in the desert. The boy's eyes shifted from Daniel to the back seat. The baby let out another fragile cry. The sound hung in the air. The boy's expression changed. His brows pulled together slightly. Not confusion. Not fear. Recognition. Daniel noticed it, and it irritated him. The driver shifted nervously. Sir, what? Daniel barked. Something is wrong with the baby. Daniel's stomach twisted. He turned again, touching his son's cheek. The skin felt hot. The breathing was shallow now. Small gasps instead of full breaths. For a second, just 1 second, Daniel's mind went blank. All his power, all his money, all his influence, useless. The wind outside grew louder, brushing against the SUV like a warning. The boy stepped closer again, now only a few feet from the vehicle. Close enough for Daniel to see the calm in his eyes. Not fear, not hesitation. Calm. Sir, the boy said softly through the open window. His voice was gentle, respectful. Daniel stiffened. What? The boy pointed carefully toward the back seat. The baby, he cannot breathe well. Daniel's pride flared instantly. And what would you know about that? The question came out sharp, defensive. The boy didn't look offended. He didn't step back. He just stood there, steady in the heat. Another weak cry came from the baby, even softer this time. The driver's voice trembled. Sir, we are hours from town. Daniel's heart pounded harder. He looked at his son again, the tiny chest rising unevenly, the color fading little by little. Fear began to crack through the walls he had built his entire life. He looked back at the boy, still standing there, still watching, still calm. The desert wind lifted sand around the child's feet, but he didn't flinch. For the first time, Daniel noticed something else in the boy's face. Not curiosity. Concern. Real concern. And something inside Daniel shifted, just slightly, but pride held him in place. He swallowed hard. Go back to your family, he said, though his voice was less steady now. The boy didn't move. Instead, he took one slow step forward, closer to the SUV, closer to the baby, closer to a moment that would change everything. Daniel felt his chest tighten as the baby's breathing grew even weaker. The desert felt larger, the silence heavier, and standing in front of stranded Billionaire's car was a barefoot boy who refused to walk away. Daniel paced in the sand, his phone pressed so tightly to his ear that his knuckles turned white. Come on, he muttered, turning in slow circles as if a signal might appear if he faced the right direction. The screen showed nothing. No bars, no connection, just a cold, silent emptiness. The wind moved across the desert in long, lonely waves, carrying grains of sand that brushed against his shoes and the metal body of the SUV. It sounded like whispering, endless whispering. Behind him, inside the car, the baby made a weak sound. Not even a full cry anymore, just a faint, tired whimper that seemed to fade before it fully formed. Daniel froze. He turned his head slowly toward the open door. His son's tiny chest rose, then paused too long before falling again. Each breath looked like work. Each breath looked like a struggle. Daniel's heart began to pound harder. He pressed the phone to his ear again, walking farther from the car, raising his arm high as if reaching for the sky. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Only wind answered. Then a soft voice spoke behind him. Sir. Daniel turned sharply. The Nomad boy stood a few feet away now, closer than before. His small frame looked fragile in the vast desert, but his eyes were steady, focused, watching the baby. The boy lifted his hand slightly, pointing toward the car. He cannot breathe well. Daniel felt irritation rise instantly, sharp and defensive. What would you know? He snapped, his voice cutting through the air. The boy lowered his eyes for a moment, not in fear but in respect, then looked back up. I have seen this before, he said quietly. My baby sister. Daniel let out a short, cold laugh. It wasn't real amusement. It was fear trying to disguise itself. You expect me to trust you? The words came out harsher than he intended, but pride pushed him forward. Pride had always protected him. Pride had built his empire. Pride had never failed him before. But this was not a boardroom. This was not a deal. This was his child. The driver stood near the car, shifting nervously, glancing from Daniel to the baby and back again. The man's face had lost its color. Sweat ran down his temple despite the dry heat. Sir, the driver said quietly, his voice trembling. Daniel didn't respond. He was staring at the boy, searching his face for doubt, for fear, for any sign that he was just a child pretending to know something he didn't. But the boy's expression didn't change. Calm, serious, certain. Another faint sound came from the baby, softer than before. Daniel turned instantly, rushing to the car. He leaned in, touching his son's cheek. The skin felt too warm. The tiny lips had begun to lose their color, fading toward a pale blue that made Daniel's stomach twist. His wife sat in the back seat, cradling the baby, tears silently running down her face. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She only looked at Daniel with eyes full of fear. And in that look, Daniel felt something break inside him. He stepped back out of the car, breathing hard, running a hand through his hair. The desert suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing, and even though there were no walls at all, behind him, the boy was still there, waiting, watching. Seconds passed. Long, heavy seconds that seemed to stretch into minutes. The only sound was the wind and the faint, uneven breathing of a child fighting for air. The driver finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we have no one else." Those words hung in the air. No one else. Daniel swallowed hard. He looked at the empty horizon, at the endless sand, at the silent sky that offered no help, no rescue, no answers. Then he looked back at his son. Tiny, helpless, fading. And for the first time in years, Daniel Hartley felt powerless. Truly powerless. His pride began to crack under the weight of fear. Slowly, he turned toward the boy. "If you're wrong," Daniel said, his voice low, trying to sound firm, but the tremor in it betrayed him. He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't. The threat felt hollow even as he spoke it. The boy didn't answer. He simply stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something sacred. Then he reached out his hands. Small hands. Dusty hands. Steady hands. Daniel stared at them. For a moment, everything inside him resisted. Every instinct. Every belief about control, about status, about who could help and who could not. But then the baby made a weak choking sound from inside the car, and pride lost battle. Daniel stepped aside. The driver exhaled softly, almost in relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for minutes. The boy climbed carefully into the car, moving with quiet confidence. Not rushed, not afraid, just focused. Daniel stood outside, watching through the open door, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. The desert wind moved around them, lifting sand into the air, carrying the sound of the baby's fragile breathing into the empty distance. And in that moment, the life of a billionaire's son rested entirely in the hands of a barefoot boy from the desert. Daniel didn't know what would happen next. He only knew that everything now depended on a child he had almost sent away. The boy's hands were steady. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. Not fear, not hesitation. Steady hands, moving with a quiet confidence that felt strange coming from someone so small. The desert wind blew softly through the open door of the SUV as the boy leaned closer to the baby, his eyes focused, calm, and deeply serious. Daniel stood just outside the car, every muscle in his body tense. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking his ribs. He wanted to stop this. He wanted to pull his child back, to take control again, to be the man who always fixed things. But he didn't know how to fix this. And that truth held him frozen. The boy gently lifted the baby, supporting the tiny head with careful precision. His movements were slow, respectful, almost tender, as if he understood how fragile life could be. The baby made a faint, choking sound, and Daniel's chest tightened painfully. The boy tilted the baby's head slightly, adjusting the position with small, practiced motions. His fingers were gentle but sure, as if he had done this many times before. Sometimes sand and dry air make babies choke, the boy said softly, his voice calm in the stillness. They cannot clear their breath. Daniel blinked, surprised by how certain the boy sounded. There was no pride in his voice, no attempt to impress, only quiet knowledge. The driver stood nearby, holding the door, watching as if afraid to even breathe. The boy reached into the fold of his scarf and pulled out a small, clean strip of cloth. He wrapped it lightly around the baby's chest, careful not to press too hard. Then he began a gentle, rhythmic motion, supporting the baby's back and chest in a slow, steady pattern. Daniel didn't understand what he was doing, but the movements looked deliberate, practiced, guided by memory rather than guesswork. The seconds stretched painfully. Nothing happened. The baby's chest moved weakly, barely rising. The silence inside the car felt heavy, suffocating, filled only by the faint whistle of wind outside. Daniel's hands began to tremble. He pressed them against the side of the vehicle, trying to steady himself. What if this didn't work? What if he had trusted the wrong person? What if he had just watched his child's last moments in silence? His throat tightened, and he realized he was holding his breath. The boy continued the motion, calm, patient, focused entirely on the baby. There was no panic in his face, only concentration and quiet determination. Then, suddenly, the baby's body jerked. A small sound escaped his lips. A sharp, sudden gasp, like someone breaking the surface of deep water. Daniel's head snapped up. The baby drew in a deep breath, his tiny chest rising fully for the first time in minutes. Then another breath came, stronger than before. And then a cry, not weak, not fading, strong, loud, alive. The sound shattered the silence of the desert, like thunder rolling across empty land. Daniel staggered backward, his legs unsteady, his breath catching his throat as relief crashed over him all at once. The tension that had been gripping his chest loosened. So, suddenly, it almost made him dizzy. Inside the car, his wife began to cry openly now, clutching the baby as the color slowly returned to his face. The pale blue faded, replaced by warm pink. The tiny hands moved again, stronger now, waving in the air as the baby cried with full strength. The boy gently adjusted the baby one last time, making sure the breathing was steady, then carefully placed him back into his mother's arms. He didn't smile. He didn't look proud. He simply stepped back quietly, as if what he'd done was ordinary. The driver let out a long breath, his voice shaking as he whispered, Thank you so much." The boy gave a small nod, but said nothing. Daniel stood there, unable to speak. His mind felt blank, overwhelmed, flooded with emotions he could not sort through. He looked at the boy again, but now he saw him differently. He no longer saw dusty clothes or bare feet or the marks of poverty. He saw steady hands, calm eyes, courage, knowledge, a quiet strength that saved a life when all the wealth in the world could do nothing. Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Humility. It was a strange feeling, almost uncomfortable, like standing in a place where he no longer held power. For years, he had believed that money solved problems, that influence opened every door, that control was something you earned and never lost. But here, in the middle of an endless desert, a barefoot boy had done what he could not. The wind moved softly across the sand, carrying the fading echoes of the baby's cries into the distance. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low, almost hesitant. How did you know what to do?" The boy looked at him quietly. "My mother taught me," he said. "When babies are sick in the desert, there is no doctor. We learn to help each other." There was no pride in the words, only truth. Daniel swallowed, feeling a tightness in his throat he didn't understand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The desert stretched endlessly around them, silent and vast, as if the world itself was pausing to witness this moment. The boy stepped back, turning slightly, as if preparing to leave, as if his part in the story was already finished. Daniel watched him, a strange feeling rising in his chest, a quiet realization forming that this moment was changing something inside him in a way he could not yet explain. Because sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who carry the greatest strength. And as the boy walked slowly across the sand, disappearing toward the distant tents on the horizon, Daniel stood there, holding his son, knowing that nothing in his life would ever feel the same again. The sound of helicopter blades came long before anyone could see it. A low, distant thumping that rolled across the desert like approaching thunder. At first it was faint, almost lost in the wind, but slowly it grew louder, closer, until the air itself seemed to vibrate. Daniel stood beside the SUV, holding his son carefully in his arms. The baby was breathing normally now, sleeping softly against his shoulder as if nothing had happened, as if the past hour had not nearly stolen his life. Rescue vehicles appeared on the horizon soon after, their shapes shimmering in the heat, growing larger with every passing minute. The driver had managed to climb a ridge not far away and catch a weak signal, enough to send their location. Help had come. Doctors checked the baby quickly, confirming what Daniel already knew in his heart. The child was stable, safe, alive. People moved around him, asking questions, offering water, checking the vehicle, speaking into radios. But Daniel barely heard them. Their voices sounded distant, like echoes underwater, because Daniel was looking somewhere else, far beyond the rescue team, beyond the SUV, beyond the cluster of movement and noise. He was watching the boy. The Nomad child stood near a small tent in the distance, just at the edge of the desert camp where a few scattered families lived. Life there looked simple, quiet, a small fire pit, warm blankets hanging to dry, a few goats wandering slowly across the sand. The boy stood there as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if saving a life was just another part of the day. Daniel felt something stir in his chest again, that unfamiliar feeling that had begun growing inside him since the moment he saw his son breathe again. He handed the baby gently to his wife and began walking. Each step across the sand felt slower than the last, as if he were walking towards something larger than a conversation, something that would change him in a way he could not yet understand. The boy noticed him approaching, but did not move away. He simply waited, calm and quiet, his eyes steady in the afternoon light. Daniel stopped a few feet in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly between them, carrying grains of sand across the ground. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all day. "What is your name?" The boy looked at him and answered simply, "Yusuf." Daniel repeated the name in his mind. Yusuf. Then, without fully thinking about it, Daniel did something he had not done in years. Something that felt strange and unfamiliar. He knelt, the sand pressed against his expensive trousers. But he didn't notice. He was looking at the boy at eye level now, not from above, not from a place of power, but as one human being to another. "You saved my son," Daniel said softly. His voice shook slightly, and he didn't try to hide it. "You saved my world." Yusuf didn't smile. He didn't look proud. He simply nodded once, as if accepting the words but not needing them. In the desert, the boy said quietly, "We help each other." Such simple words. But they carried a truth Daniel felt deep inside his chest. For years, he had lived in a world where everything had a price, where help came with contracts, where kindness was rare and often expected something in return. But this boy, this child who owned almost nothing, had given everything without asking for anything. Daniel stood slowly, his heart heavy with thoughts he could not yet put into words. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the desert in gold and crimson, Daniel sat quietly beside his family, holding his sleeping son, watching the horizon. And for the first time in many years, he was not thinking about money, not thinking about deals, not thinking about power. He was thinking about Yusuf. In the weeks that followed, Daniel kept his promise. Not with grand speeches or public displays, but with quiet action. Yusuf and his family received medical care. The children were given access to education. A small, strong home was built near a nearby town where they could live safely, without losing their way of life. But the greatest change was not in Yusuf's life. It was in Daniel's. Something inside him had shifted that day in the desert. Something deep and permanent. He began to listen more. Not just to people like himself, but to everyone. Workers, drivers, cleaners, strangers. He began to notice faces he once passed without seeing. He began to judge less, to question his own assumptions, to understand that dignity does not come from wealth or titles or fine clothes. It comes from the heart. Months later, Daniel found himself standing in a crowded room during a business event, surrounded by powerful people speaking loudly about success and status. For the first time, their words sounded different to him, smaller, less important, because he had seen real greatness, not in a boardroom, not in a mansion, but in the quiet courage of a barefoot boy in the desert. And sometimes late at night, when his son slept peacefully in his crib, Daniel would remember the sound of that first strong cry, the cry that meant life had returned. And he would remember Yusuf, because that day taught him something he would carry for the rest of his life. Greatness is not measured by wealth, power, or status. Sometimes, the smallest hands carry the greatest courage. And sometimes, the people the world overlooks are the ones who save it.